So one of the big questions coming out of this unbelievable moment that we're living through is what is going to change? And change means both specific legislation, it means elections, it means all of those things, but it also means how do people's views and attitudes change as a result of what they've witnessed or as a result of seeing the protest, as a result of seeing this movement across the country? And we're getting some early indications from a new CBS poll that, in fact, a lot of people's minds are being changed right now. So, in particular, there seems to be much more awareness of racial discrimination right now as opposed to in recent years. So you've got the numbers here up on the screen. So looking back, right after the LA riots, there was only half the country that said they saw progress on ending racial discrimination since the civil rights era. Those numbers moved up dramatically in 2014, 79%. 50 years after the Civil Rights Act passed, 79% said, yes, we're seeing progress. 71% after the Charleston shooting said, yes, we're making progress, even after watching those horrific events with Dylan Roof. Now, that number has dropped down to 56%. So an indication, Saagar, that people are really reevaluating the nation that we live in, the structural systems, and what it is. The reality of racism in the country is being reevaluated before our very eyes.
Yeah, and it actually makes me very sad because I actually looked into the crosstabs of that, and a lot of this is actually driven by college-educated whites, which is college-educated whites are the ones who have been most likely to change their attitudes on racial divisions in America. And there's even a class dynamic here in particular, which is that both black and white Americans both say that that both black and white Americans have a relatively equal shot of making it, while the view of discrimination and kind of the view of how America and its racial fabric is made up has taken a much more negative turn amongst those who are much more educated. And that really, I mean, comes to the core of what a lot of I've been saying over the last couple of weeks, which is that I think a lot of this is driven. Look, I mean, I don't think that we can ever deny racism and so much of the systemic inequality that we have within our system. But that if you look at the polling data, that much of the downturn there is actually very much concentrated in kind of the upper professional managerial and disproportionately white upper class and the way that they view race. This is something that I'm not going to cite Vox very favorably often on this show, but one of their best pieces of writing that they've ever had is called The Great Awakening. And it's very much about racial attitudes amongst white Americans and how in many ways they are more radical on questions of race than black Americans themselves. And I think we covered this in terms of how vice presidential choices and what upper middle class white suburbanites that much of the Democratic Party finds itself centered around. So overall, it does track with that data, and especially at a time like this.
I think it's nothing but positive if white people are gaining more race consciousness personally, whether they're, affluent or less affluent or educated or less educated or whatever. I mean, you also look at among black citizens, only 38% say that they see a lot of progress getting rid of discrimination. So clearly among African Americans who are living with the reality of race and class and how those things intersect, there is a deep sense that we have a long, long way to go. To me, look, I've said this before and I really feel this. I was feeling deeply depressed in this country with what was going on with coronavirus and the complete failure of government and mass unemployment and nothing really happening. I mean, I felt like the country was so apathetic. And now, through this horrific, unconscionable violence that we all witnessed, it really has awakened a nation and caused people to look through new eyes at what is going on before them, caused them to get out in the streets and actually fight for the fundamental worth and dignity of their fellow citizens. I see that as nothing but a positive development. So when you think about progress, yes, we think about laws. Yes, we think about specific platforms, specific politicians, all of that. But when you change someone's consciousness and you make them see things through a different lens, I think that is perhaps even more powerful than any specific law that could be passed right now. And we're also seeing, Saagar, and this is pretty remarkable. Obviously, the president's core base, the most rock solid part of his support, has been white evangelicals. They're the ones that, back in 2016, Trump brings Pence on board. He announces his list of Supreme Court nominees, and anyone who was nervous about, his own personal moral failings, that white evangelical community got on board, and they have been his strongest supporters. Well, there's a new poll. This is PRRI. It's written up in the New York Times that shows his approval rating has slipped 15 points among white evangelicals as they see how he's handling or not handling or exacerbating these issues of race within the country. One visible sign of that is Pat Robertson, of course, founder of the Christian Coalition, who took issue with President Trump's handling of this. He said, "You just don't do that, Mr. President. We're one race and we need to love each other." So even among his core supporters, right, even among the people that he really was playing to with the whole Bible photo op bizarre situation, they seem deeply troubled too by the direction that he is taking the country in and some of the actions that he's taken vis-a-vis the Floyd killing and the treatment of protesters.
Yeah, and you've actually even seen a more dramatic drop amongst Catholics. White Catholics has fallen 27 points in the same one. We should caution one of the important lines in the piece is that, even in 2016, he actually had around exactly the same 61% approval rating and still netted about 81% of the vote. And so in terms of the zero-sum nature of how people vote, it certainly could change a little bit of the dynamics there. I want to go back to something that you said, because I think this is, and I respect and I understand that position. I think it is very important, though, which is that increasing race consciousness and the idea around race consciousness is very important, I think, to understand how that can very much drown out. And I know this is not the case with you, and I don't think it's the case with most of the people kind of on the anti-establishment left, but that it's very much something that maybe your side will have to watch out for, which is that the more race consciousness, and especially for people who only have race consciousness, it drowns out and often stomps on ideas of class. And it stomps on the ideas, what we talked about previously in the show about 50% unemployment. So, increased race consciousness is a double-edged sword. And I think that it's one of these things where whenever a professional managerial elite only views things through that particular lens as what is wrong with the country, it will absolutely not deliver the type of political and policy change that I think you and I really believe in as a result for, working class Americans on this show.
Yeah, if it collapses down to let's make sure the body cams are turned on and let's have another diversity initiative, if it collapses down to just race reductionism and just the sort of tokenist, we talked about here how there was this instinct after Amy Klobuchar came out that she failed to bring charges against Derek Chauvin before, and she's sort of off the VP list. There was a push towards Kamala Harris, who has an equally problematic record on a lot of these issues, but that's the very comfortable identity politics tokenist approach that you're right. People in power are very comfortable with. Cornel West calls it black faces in high places. And that's not to say that representation doesn't matter, but if it doesn't challenge power, if it doesn't come with more systematic change, you're right, then it will all amount to nothing. But that's why, or I shouldn't say nothing, but to very little. Mm-hmm. That's why I think we have to be engaged with this movement. That's why I think we have to be pushing to look at those more structural issues, because right now, look, you've got an opening, you've got an awakening, you've got people who are evaluating things in a different way for the first time. And that can go in the direction of, something that's very comfortable, or it can go in the direction of something that is more uncomfortable, that is more transformative. And that's obviously the direction that I want to work to push things in. On the note of evangelicals, and this is anecdotal, but we judge things through the lens of our friends and our neighbors and what we're hearing. And I can tell you, I have a dear friend in Kentucky who is evangelical Christian, whose faith is the center of their lives, him and his family's life. They really try to live by those values. And, he's very culturally conservative, traditionally votes Republican, had some issues sort of morally with Trump, but ultimately got on board because of the courts, because of those values being really important to him. And he is really seeing things in a different way right now and is really grappling with, ideas and concepts around race that he really had never sort of thought through before. And it's changing his consciousness to the point where he's really reconsidering how he will vote this November. And I'm sure he can't be the only one. And that's what this poll reflects, is he's not the only one. There are a lot of people out there who are viewing this, and even outside of the specific policy issues, are looking at some of the divisive actions of President Trump. He shared a letter calling the peaceful protesters in Lafayette Park that were cleared out with tear gas and rubber bullets, calling them terrorists, right? People are there's some church ladies, peaceful protesters there who were chanting, who were just wanting change, exercising their First Amendment rights. I think that anyone, regardless of where they are on the issues, feel that that is a deeply divisive approach that is just going to tear the country further apart.
It's certainly possible. I would just say I think it all matters around the national conversation because, the more and more that the campaign progresses and the more that we see, Biden, I would not be surprised if he made a similar level of Supreme Court pledge. I mean, he said Black woman and much of that. The more that they discuss much of that, I think that in terms of its impact on the faith community, I highly doubt that we'll see depressed evangelical turnout for President Trump in 2020. But I could be wrong. I mean, but just knowing what I know, in terms of my own friends and the way they evaluate politics, and then also just in terms of their own voting patterns over the last 25 years, I think, his approval rating does matter. But I think that 61% approval, but 81% vote turnout is something that, tells a story about how people really vote in this country. I mean, remember, Trump and Hillary both had 30% approval ratings in across the country, and obviously won a lot more than that in terms of the vote. So the way people vote is very complicated and it's multifaceted.
Yeah, that's true. And right now, and I actually do think that this is the demo to watch, the hates both the candidates demo.
Yes.
Last time around went to Trump. This time around so far is going to Joe Biden. And I actually think that may be the key group to keep your eye on when you have two candidates who are not particularly loved.
Not just going to Biden, going to him by a 2-to-1 margin. That's, I think, Trump's biggest problem in this entire election, which is, I hate the system, but, last time I went this way, this time I'm thinking about going that way. That's one of Trump's biggest problems, I think, in this entire election.
All right, we're going to have more Rising for you after this.